Millionaire laughs at a beggar's request. What happens next will leave you speechless. The bustling city streets were alive with the sound of car horns, hurried footsteps, and the occasional laughter of tourists admiring the towering skyline. In the midst of it all stood Richard Langston, a man whose tailored suit, polished leather shoes, and gold watch screamed wealth and success. Richard was the CEO of Langston Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that spanned industries from tech to real estate. He exuded confidence as he exited the luxury black car that had just dropped him off in front of one of his skyscrapers. Today was just another day for Richard. Meetings, deals, and the constant chase of more wealth. As he strode confidently toward the building, a voice broke through the ambient noise of the city. "Excuse me, sir?" Richard stopped in his tracks, annoyed by the interruption. He turned to see a man sitting on the sidewalk, his clothes tattered and his face weary. The man held a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and homeless. Any help appreciated." Richard frowned. "What do you want?" The man, whose name was Henry, looked up with hope in his eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Could you spare some change or maybe help me get something to eat?" Richard's lips curled into a smirk. "Spare some change? Do you have any idea how hard I've worked for what I have? I didn't get here by begging on the street." Henry's face fell, but he tried to muster the courage to speak again. "I understand, sir. I didn't mean to offend you. I used to have a job, a family, but life took a turn, and now I'm just trying to survive." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Everyone has a sob story, don't they? Look, why don't you stop wasting time out here and go find a job? That's how you fix your situation, not by asking people like me for handouts." The words stung, but Henry didn't let his composure falter. "If it were that simple, sir, I wouldn't be here. I've been trying." Richard rolled his eyes and reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He held it up, just out of Henry's reach. "You want this?" Henry nodded hesitantly, unsure if Richard was serious. "Tell you what," Richard said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "If you can prove to me that you're worth it, if you can show me you have some ambition, I'll give you a lot more than this." Henry looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Richard knelt slightly, his grin widening. "You said you used to have a job and a family. Tell me what happened. Convince me that you're not just another bum looking for a handout." The crowd around them started to notice the exchange. Some pedestrians slowed down, curious about the scene unfolding before them. Henry hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation. Finally, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I used to work in construction," he said. "I had a steady job, a wife, and a little girl. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Then, 3 years ago, I got injured on the job. A scaffolding collapsed, and I broke my leg. It took months to heal, and by the time I was ready to work again, the company had replaced me." Richard raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "So you let one setback ruin your life?" Henry shook his head. "It wasn't just that. Without my income, we fell behind on our bills. My wife tried to keep us afloat by taking on extra work, but it wasn't enough. We lost our home. Then my wife got sick. Cancer. We couldn't afford the treatment. She passed away a year ago." The crowd around them grew silent as Henry's voice trembled. "After that, everything fell apart. My daughter is living with my sister now because I couldn't provide for her. I've been trying to get back on my feet, but no one wants to hire a man who's been homeless for over a year. I'm not asking for pity. I just need a chance." For a moment, Richard said nothing. He studied Henry's face, searching for any sign of deceit. But all he saw was sincerity. And yet, he couldn't resist making a final jab. "That's quite the sob story," he said, tossing the $100 bill onto the ground in front of Henry. "There's your chance. Go buy yourself some food." Henry looked at the bill but didn't reach for it. Instead, he met Richard's gaze with quiet dignity. "Keep your money," he said. "I may be down, but I'm not going to let you humiliate me." Richard's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments, but he quickly recovered. "Suit yourself," he said, straightening his tie. "Good luck with your life." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the lobby of his skyscraper. The crowd slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads in disapproval at Richard's behavior, others offering Henry sympathetic glances. Hours later, Richard sat in his corner office on the 40th floor, overlooking the city. He couldn't stop thinking about the interaction with Henry. There was something about the man's quiet dignity, his refusal to accept the money, that stuck with him. His assistant, Margaret, entered the room with a folder of documents. "Mr. Langston, these are the contracts for the new development project. They're ready for your signature." Richard barely glanced at the papers. "Margaret, do you believe in second chances?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the question. I suppose I do, sir. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Richard said, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. "That'll be all for now." Margaret nodded and left the room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of guilt. The next morning, Richard found himself standing on the same sidewalk where he had encountered Henry. The beggar was still there, his sign propped up beside him as he sat with his head bowed. Richard approached, his footsteps purposeful. Henry looked up, his expression wary. "What do you want?" he asked. Richard knelt down, meeting Henry's gaze. "I owe you an apology," he said. Henry's eyes widened in surprise. "An apology?" "I judged you without knowing your story," Richard admitted. "And I acted like a complete jerk. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'd like to make things right." Henry studied him for a moment, trying to determine if the offer was genuine. "How?" Richard pulled out a business card and handed it to Henry. "This is the address of a shelter I work with. They offer job training and housing assistance. Tell them I sent you, and they'll get you set up." Henry took the card hesitantly. "Why are you doing this?" Richard shrugged. "Let's just say I realized that everyone deserves a second chance." Henry held the business card in his hands, his calloused fingers tracing over the embossed text. He looked up at Richard, unsure whether to trust the man who had mocked him just a day earlier. The doubt lingered in his eyes, but something about Richard's tone felt different. There was no arrogance this time, no condescension. For the first time, Henry saw a flicker of sincerity in Richard's expression. "I appreciate the gesture," Henry said cautiously. "But how do I know this isn't just some publicity stunt? Rich guys like you don't usually show up twice." Richard paused, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't used to people doubting his motives. He was used to people fawning over him, trying to curry favor. But this wasn't a business deal, and he realized he couldn't talk his way through it with charm or authority. "You don't," Richard admitted finally. "You don't have any reason to trust me, and I haven't given you one. But I'm here because, well, maybe I needed to learn a lesson too." Henry's brow furrowed. "A lesson?" Richard exhaled deeply, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "I've spent my life climbing to the top, focused on my success, my goals, my wealth. I've looked down on people who didn't have what I had, assuming they just didn't try hard enough. Yesterday, when I walked away from you, I felt off. For the first time, I realized how wrong I was to judge you, or anyone, without knowing their story." Henry studied him, still unsure, but there was no denying the earnestness in Richard's voice. After a long pause, he tucked the business card into his coat pocket. "All right," he said. "I'll check it out." Richard nodded, relief washing over him. "That's all I ask." Later that day, Henry made his way to the address printed on the card. It was a clean, modern building in a part of the city he rarely ventured into. The sign above the door read, Hope Harbor Community Center. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was all too good to be true, but the thought of his daughter gave him the courage to step inside. The reception area was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the harsh streets outside. A friendly woman behind the desk greeted him with a smile. "Welcome to Hope Harbor," she said. "How can I help you?" Henry pulled the card from his pocket and handed it to her. Someone named Richard Langston told me to come here." The woman's eyes lit up. "Oh, Mr. Langston. He's one of our biggest supporters. You're in the right place. Let me call someone to get you started." A few minutes later, a caseworker named Maria appeared, introducing herself with a firm handshake. She led Henry to her office, where they discussed his situation. For the first time in years, Henry felt heard, truly heard. Maria asked about his skills, his goals, and his hopes for the future. By the end of the meeting, she had lined up temporary housing for him at the shelter and enrolled him in a job training program that matched his experience in construction. "We'll help you get back on your feet," Maria said warmly. "You're not alone in this." Henry left the center that day feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Meanwhile, Richard found himself reflecting on the encounter. He couldn't explain why Henry's story had struck such a chord with him, but it had stirred something he hadn't felt in years. He realized that his success had made him insulated, disconnected from the struggles of the average person. The wealth and power that once seemed so fulfilling now felt hollow. The next morning, Richard called his assistant, Margaret, into his office. "I want you to arrange a meeting with the director of Hope Harbor," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Hope Harbor? That's the community center you've donated to in the past, right?" "Yes," Richard said. "But I've never actually been there. That's going to change." A week later, Richard visited Hope Harbor for the first time. The director, a kind-hearted woman named Evelyn, gave him a tour of the facility. She showed him the classrooms where job training sessions were held, the dormitory where residents could sleep safely, and the kitchen where volunteers prepared meals for the homeless. As they walked through the center, Richard noticed Henry sitting in one of the classrooms, listening intently to a presentation on workplace safety. Their eyes met briefly, and Henry gave him a small nod. Richard nodded back, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "You've done incredible work here," Richard said to Evelyn as the tour concluded. "But I imagine you're always in need of more resources?" Evelyn smiled wryly. "That's the understatement of the year. We do what we can, but demand always outweighs supply." Richard's mind raced with possibilities. "What if I could help you expand? Build a larger facility, offer more programs?" Evelyn's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Very," Richard said. "I have the means, and I think it's time I start using them for something that matters." Over the next several months, Richard threw himself into the project. He worked closely with Evelyn and her team to design a state-of-the-art facility that would triple Hope Harbor's capacity. He poured millions of dollars into the expansion, ensuring that the center would have everything it needed to serve the community. During this time, Richard and Henry crossed paths often. Henry had secured a steady job through the training program and was beginning to rebuild his life. Though their relationship had started on rocky ground, they developed a mutual respect for one another. One evening, as the new facility's grand opening approached, Richard invited Henry to his office. The two men sat across from each other, the city skyline glowing behind them. "I want to thank you," Richard said. Henry frowned. "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding me what's important," Richard said. "I started this journey thinking I was helping you, but the truth is, you've helped me just as much. You showed me that success isn't about money or power, it's about making a difference." Henry nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just another arrogant rich guy who didn't care about anyone but himself. But you've proven me wrong." Richard chuckled. "That makes two of us." The grand opening of the new Hope Harbor facility was a moment of celebration. The community turned out in droves to see the expanded center, which now included a daycare, a medical clinic, and an employment resource hub. Richard stood on stage, delivering a speech that was met with thunderous applause. Henry watched from the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. He thought about his daughter, who had recently moved back in with him now that he had a stable home and job. For the first time in years, he felt like he was on solid ground. After the ceremony, Henry approached Richard, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for this, but for everything." Richard shook his hand firmly. "You don't need to thank me. You're the reason I did this." The two men stood there for a moment, two lives forever changed by a chance encounter on a busy city street. In the months that followed, Hope Harbor became a beacon of hope for thousands of people. And while Richard continued to thrive in his business endeavors, he found a new purpose in giving back. He and Henry remained friends, their unlikely bond serving as a testament to the power of second chances. Because sometimes, it's not the wealth you accumulate but the lives you touch that truly defines your legacy. As Hope Harbor grew into a thriving sanctuary for those in need, its impact began to ripple far beyond the city limits. Richard Langston's transformation from an aloof billionaire to a champion for the downtrodden became the talk of the town, and news outlets couldn't resist covering the story of his collaboration with Henry, the once homeless man who had inadvertently opened his eyes to a greater purpose. For Richard, the recognition was secondary. What mattered most to him now was the tangible difference he was making in people's lives. The bustling hallways of Hope Harbor, filled with children laughing, adults learning new skills, and volunteers working tirelessly, were a testament to what could be achieved when someone took a chance on others and on themselves. One evening, as Richard walked through the newly expanded facility, he noticed Henry sitting in the corner of the daycare area, watching a group of children play. Among them was a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes who laughed as she built a tower of blocks. "That your daughter?" Richard asked, approaching quietly. Henry turned and smiled. "Yeah, that's Sophie. She's everything to me." Richard sat down next to him, the hum of the bustling center filling the air. "She looks happy." "She is," Henry said, his voice tinged with both pride and disbelief. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can give her a real future. A home. Stability. None of this would have been possible without Hope Harbor, or without you." Richard shook his head. "You made this happen, Henry. All I did was open a door. You're the one who walked through it." Henry chuckled softly. "You know, it's funny. A few months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I'm sitting here, watching my daughter play in a place that feels like hope." Richard looked at Sophie, her innocent joy a stark contrast to the struggles her father had endured. "You deserve this, Henry. And so does she." The two men's bond continued to deepen as they worked together to expand Hope Harbor's outreach programs. Henry, now employed as a project coordinator for the center, became a trusted voice for the homeless community. His first-hand experience allowed him to connect with people in a way few others could, and his resilience inspired everyone who crossed his path. One day, as they sat in a planning meeting, Evelyn, the center's director, brought up an ambitious idea. "We've been so focused on helping people here in the city," she said, "but what if we could replicate Hope Harbor in other towns? Imagine how many lives we could change if we expanded our model." The room buzzed with excitement at the suggestion, but Richard raised a hand, his expression thoughtful. "It's a great idea," he said. "But if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. We can't just build more facilities. We need to create a framework that ensures their long-term success." Henry nodded in agreement. "We'd also need to partner with local leaders in each town. They're the ones who know their communities best." Evelyn smiled. "I knew I could count on you too to think big." Over the next year, the Hope Harbor team embarked on a nationwide expansion plan. Richard used his influence and resources to secure funding, while Henry traveled to various cities, meeting with community leaders and sharing his story. Together, they inspired others to join their mission, and soon, new Hope Harbor centers began to sprout up in towns across the country. Each new facility brought with it a unique set of challenges, but also incredible rewards. In one town, they helped a single mother escape an abusive relationship and find a stable job. In another, they provided a veteran with the mental health support he needed to rebuild his life. The stories of transformation were endless, and each one reaffirmed the importance of their work. One day, during a visit to one of the new centers, Richard and Henry were approached by a young man named Marcus. He was thin and nervous, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few months ago, I was sleeping in my car, and I didn't know how I was going to make it. Then I found Hope Harbor. Now I have a job, and I'm taking night classes. You saved my life." Henry placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You saved your life, Marcus. We just gave you a little help." Marcus smiled shyly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Well, I'll never forget what you did for me." As Marcus walked away, Richard turned to Henry. "You know, moments like that make it all worth it." Henry nodded. "They're the reason we keep going." But not everyone was thrilled with the success of Hope Harbor. In some circles, there were whispers of resentment. Critics accused Richard of using the initiative to polish his public image, while others argued that the program was enabling people to rely on handouts rather than working for their success. One particularly vocal detractor was a rival businessman named Alan Vickers. Alan, known for his ruthless approach to business, had long viewed Richard as a competitor. When he learned about Hope Harbor, he dismissed it as a publicity stunt and made it his mission to discredit the program. During a televised debate on philanthropy and social responsibility, Alan confronted Richard directly. "You talk about giving people second chances," Alan said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "But how do you know they're not just taking advantage of your generosity? Isn't it naive to think you can solve systemic problems with charity?" Richard remained calm, his voice steady as he replied, "Hope Harbor isn't about handouts, Alan. It's about creating opportunities. It's about showing people that someone believes in them when no one else does. And if even one person uses that opportunity to turn their life around, then it's worth it." Alan smirked. "That's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't change the fact that most of these people wouldn't be in their situation if they had made better choices." Henry, who had been sitting quietly in the audience, couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood up, his voice firm. "I didn't choose to lose my job. I didn't choose for my wife to die or for my daughter to grow up without a home. Life isn't always fair, and sometimes people need a little help to get back on their feet. That's what Hope Harbor is about." The room fell silent as Henry's words hung in the air. Even Alan seemed momentarily taken aback. Richard looked at Henry, his chest swelling with pride. "Well said." The debate only strengthened public support for Hope Harbor. Donations poured in, and more people than ever reached out, wanting to be part of the movement. For Richard and Henry, the experience was a reminder of why they had started this journey in the first place. As they stood outside the original Hope Harbor facility one evening, watching the sun set over the city, Henry turned to Richard with a smile. "You know, if someone had told me a year ago that a guy like you would change my life, I wouldn't have believed them." Richard chuckled. "And if someone had told me a year ago that a guy like you would teach me what really matters, I wouldn't have believed them either." Henry extended his hand, and Richard shook it firmly. "Here's to second chances," Henry said. "To second chances," Richard agreed. And as the city lights flickered to life, the two men stood side by side, knowing that their work was far from over, but also knowing that together, they could accomplish anything. As Hope Harbor expanded and its impact deepened, Richard Langston and Henry found themselves busier than ever. Their nationwide initiative had sparked conversations about homelessness, second chances, and the role of philanthropy in systemic change. Yet, the success wasn't without its pressures. Richard's days were packed with meetings, interviews, and oversight of new projects, while Henry balanced his new role at Hope Harbor with being a present father to Sophie. Despite their hectic schedules, the two made it a point to check in with each other regularly. Their bond had grown from an unlikely partnership to a genuine friendship, and they both knew that their collaboration was stronger because of the mutual respect they had developed. One evening, as Richard was leaving his office late, he received a text from Henry. "Henry, any chance you're free tonight? Sophie's been asking if Mr. Rich Guy is too busy to join us for dinner." Richard smiled at the nickname Sophie had given him. Despite her young age, she had an uncanny ability to see through the facade of wealth and status. She treated Richard like a family friend, not the billionaire CEO everyone else seemed to idolize. "Richard, count me in." "What's on the menu?" "Henry, spaghetti night. You'll love it." An hour later, Richard arrived at Henry's modest apartment. The building was a far cry from the luxury penthouses Richard was used to, but it was warm, welcoming, and filled with the sound of Sophie's giggles as she raced around the living room with her stuffed animals. "Uncle Rich Guy!" Sophie exclaimed when she saw him. She ran up to him and hugged his leg, her tiny arms squeezing tightly. "Hey, kiddo," Richard said, crouching down to her level. "What's this I hear about spaghetti night? Is it as good as you say?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy makes the best spaghetti ever." Henry appeared from the kitchen, a wooden spoon in hand. "She might be biased," he said with a grin. "But it's not bad." As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere was light and relaxed. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had felt so at ease. Sophie told him about her school projects and proudly showed him a drawing she had made of Hope Harbor, complete with stick figure versions of herself, Henry, and Richard. "See? That's you," Sophie said, pointing to a stick figure in a suit with a big smile. "Because you're the boss." Richard laughed. "I love it. You've got talent, Sophie. Maybe you'll be an artist someday." Henry looked at his daughter with pride. She can be anything she wants to be. As the evening wound down, Richard found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since that fateful day on the street. He had gone from mocking a man in need to sitting at his dinner table, sharing stories and laughter. It was a humbling reminder of how much he had grown, and how much further he still wanted to go. The next morning, Richard was back in the boardroom, meeting with his senior team about the future of Langston Enterprises. While Hope Harbor had become his passion project, he still had a business to run, and balancing the two was proving to be a challenge. "Richard," Margaret said, breaking into his thoughts. "We've got an offer on the table from Vickers Holdings to buy out our West Coast properties." Richard frowned. Alan Vickers, his old rival, was the last person he wanted to deal with. The man had made it clear during the televised debate that he didn't share Richard's values, and Richard wasn't sure he could trust him. "Let me guess," Richard said. "He's offering less than market value." Margaret nodded. "Significantly less. But he's framing it as a partnership opportunity." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Selling to Vickers would free up funds that could be used to expand Hope Harbor even further, but it also meant dealing with a man whose ethics he deeply questioned. "Let's put a pin in it," Richard said finally. "I'll need more time to think." That evening, Richard met with Henry to discuss the dilemma. They sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, the hum of conversation around them providing a sense of anonymity. "What do you think?" Richard asked after explaining the situation. Henry's brow furrowed as he considered the question. "It's a tough call," he said. "On one hand, the money could do a lot of good for Hope Harbor. On the other, partnering with someone like Vickers, it could send the wrong message." "That's my fear," Richard admitted. "But at the same time, I don't want to let my personal feelings get in the way of helping more people." Henry nodded slowly. "Maybe there's a way to make it work. Set conditions for the sale, stipulations that ensure the funds are used for something meaningful. If Vickers isn't willing to agree to that, then you'll have your answer." Richard smiled. "You've got a knack for this, you know." Henry shrugged. "I've learned from the best." The next day, Richard met with Alan Vickers in person to discuss the offer. The two men sat across from each other in a sleek conference room, the tension between them palpable. "I'll cut to the chase," Richard said. "If we're going to move forward with this, there will be conditions." Alan raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being challenged. "Conditions? Such as?" "The proceeds from the sale will go directly to expanding Hope Harbor," Richard said. "And I want to guarantee that the properties will be developed in a way that benefits the community. Affordable housing, small businesses, things that make a difference." Alan smirked. "You're really leaning into this whole philanthropist thing, huh?" "This isn't about image," Richard said firmly. "It's about doing what's right. So, do we have a deal or not?" Alan leaned back in his chair, studying Richard carefully. Finally, he extended his hand. "All right, Langston. You've got yourself a deal." The sale went through a month later, and true to his word, Richard funneled the proceeds into Hope Harbor. The funds allowed them to open 5 new centers in underserved communities, each one offering housing, job training, and mental health services. At the grand opening of the newest facility, Richard and Henry stood side by side as the ribbon was cut. The crowd cheered, and Richard felt a deep sense of pride, not for himself, but for what they had accomplished together. "Looks like we did it," Henry said, clapping Richard on the back. "We're just getting started," Richard replied. As the months turned into years, Hope Harbor became a nationwide movement, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. Richard's transformation from a self-centered businessman to a compassionate leader was celebrated, but he remained humble, always crediting the people who had taught him what truly mattered. One evening, as Richard and Henry sat on the steps of the original Hope Harbor facility, they reflected on their journey. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Henry asked. "That day on the street?" "All the time," Richard said. "It's funny, isn't it? How one moment can change everything." Henry nodded. "You changed my life, Richard." And in doing that, you gave me the chance to change other people's lives. That's a ripple effect you should be proud of." Richard smiled. "The feeling's mutual, my friend." As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow on the bustling streets, the two men sat in comfortable silence, knowing that their work was far from over, but also knowing that together, they could continue to make a difference. Because sometimes, it only takes one act of kindness to spark a revolution. With Hope Harbor now a national success, Richard Langston's name became synonymous with compassion, leadership, and second chances. His story, and the ripple effect it created, was featured in magazines, documentaries, and social media posts that lauded his transformation. But for Richard, the accolades never felt like the point. He often reminded himself of Henry's story, Sophie's bright smile, and the countless lives that Hope Harbor had touched. Despite his busy schedule, Richard made it a priority to visit each of the new Hope Harbor facilities. During these visits, he met with staff, residents, and volunteers to understand their challenges and hear their stories. It was during one such visit to a facility in Chicago that he encountered a young woman named Tasha. Tasha had been living on the streets for over a year after escaping an abusive household. When Richard found her sitting quietly in the facility's cafeteria, she was hesitant to speak with him. Her arms were crossed, her gaze wary, and her voice barely above a whisper when she introduced herself. "I don't belong here," Tasha muttered. "I'm not like the others." Richard raised an eyebrow, taking a seat across from her. "What makes you say that?" "I don't know," she said, fidgeting with the sleeve of her hoodie. "I just don't feel like I'm worth all this help. There are people who've been through worse than me." Richard nodded, letting her words sink in before responding. "You know, I used to think the same thing about myself. I thought that because I hadn't struggled the way others had, I couldn't make a difference. But then I met someone who showed me that everyone's story matters. Including yours." Tasha's eyes flicked up to meet his, uncertainty still etched on her face. "I don't even know where to start." "Start small," Richard said. "One step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Tasha hesitated, then finally gave a small nod. "Maybe." It wasn't a breakthrough moment, but it was a start. And for Richard, that was enough. Meanwhile, Henry had been thriving in his role as project coordinator for Hope Harbor. He had become a mentor to many of the residents, sharing his story and encouraging them to believe in themselves. But as much as he loved his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he could be doing more. One evening, as he and Richard were catching up over coffee, Henry brought up the idea that had been weighing on his mind. "I've been thinking," Henry began, stirring his drink absent-mindedly. "What if we started a scholarship program? Something to help people who've gone through Hope Harbor get access to education or job training beyond what we offer." Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more." "Well," Henry said, his voice gaining confidence, "a lot of the people we help have dreams they've put on hold because of their circumstances. If we could give them the resources to pursue those dreams, it could change their lives even more." Richard smiled. "I love it. Let's make it happen." The Langston Hope Scholarship Program launched 6 months later, providing financial aid to individuals who had been through Hope Harbor's programs. The scholarships could be used for college tuition, vocational training, or certifications that aligned with the recipient's goals. The first cohort included 50 individuals, each with a unique story and a newfound sense of possibility. One of the scholarship recipients was Marcus, the young man who had approached Richard and Henry at a Hope Harbor event. With the help of the scholarship, Marcus enrolled in a computer programming course and eventually landed a job at a tech startup. When he sent Richard and Henry a thank you letter, it was filled with gratitude and determination. "I used to think my life was over," Marcus wrote. "Now I know it's just beginning. Thank you for believing in me." Reading the letter, Richard felt a swell of pride. Moments like this reminded him why he had committed to this work and why it mattered so deeply. But not everything was smooth sailing. As Hope Harbor's influence grew, so did the pushback from critics. Some questioned whether the program was sustainable, while others accused Richard of using it as a tax shelter. The negativity was frustrating, but Richard refused to let it deter him. Let them talk, Henry said one day when the two were discussing the latest round of criticism. We know the truth. And so do the people we've helped. Richard nodded, though the words still stung. I just hate the idea that this could discourage people from supporting us. It won't, Henry said firmly. If anything, it'll make us stronger. We've come too far to let a few naysayers stop us now. Despite the challenges, the work continued. Hope Harbor expanded to include specialized programs for veterans, single parents, and individuals struggling with addiction. Each new initiative brought its own set of hurdles, but the impact was undeniable. One day, as Richard walked through the original Hope Harbor facility, he noticed Sophie sitting in the lobby with a group of children. She was now a teenager, her bright eyes and warm smile as radiant as ever. She had started volunteering at the center after school, helping with everything from tutoring to organizing activities for the younger kids. You've got a natural talent for this, Richard said as he approached her. Sophie looked up and grinned. Guess I get it from my dad. Richard chuckled. He'd be proud to hear that. Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. You know, Uncle Rich Guy, I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up. Oh yeah? What's that? I want to run a place like Hope Harbor someday, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I want to help people the way you and Dad helped us. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. You'd be amazing at it, Sophie. And when that day comes, I'll be your first investor. Sophie beamed. Deal. As the years went by, Hope Harbor became a nationwide movement. Richard and Henry continued to work tirelessly, but they also made time to reflect on how far they had come. One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the original facility, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Richard turned to Henry with a smile. Do you ever think about that day we met? Richard asked. Henry laughed. You mean the day you threw a $100 bill at me and told me to prove myself? Richard winced playfully. Okay, when you put it like that, it sounds terrible. Henry grinned. It was terrible. But look where it led us. Yeah, Richard said, his voice softening. Who would have thought a chance encounter on the street could change so much? Henry nodded. It's funny how life works sometimes. As they sat there, side by side, the weight of their journey settled over them, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what they had built together. They knew there were still challenges ahead, but they also knew they were ready to face them. Because if there was one thing they had learned, it was this: every life has value, every story matters, and every person deserves a second chance. Hope Harbor's rise as a beacon of hope wasn't just a story about transformation, it became a movement. Richard Langston and Henry had unknowingly set off a chain reaction that spread far beyond the walls of their facilities. Communities across the country began to take note of what could happen when someone simply believed in the potential of others. But as the movement grew, so did the challenges. The cost of expansion, the pressure to maintain standards, and the sheer scale of the operations weighed heavily on Richard. It wasn't just about writing checks anymore. He was deeply involved, often visiting sites and meeting with local leaders to ensure the integrity of Hope Harbor's vision. Henry, too, found himself juggling more responsibilities than ever. As a now seasoned project coordinator and unofficial spokesperson for the movement, his days were packed with travel, interviews, and meetings. Despite the exhaustion, he remained driven by the memory of his wife and the future of his daughter, Sophie. One morning, as Richard sat in his sprawling office, Margaret entered with a cup of coffee and an unusually serious expression. Richard, we have a situation, she began, setting the coffee on his desk. What kind of situation? Richard asked, glancing up from the stack of documents he was reviewing. Margaret hesitated. There's been some backlash online. A former employee at one of the Hope Harbor centers is claiming that the program exploits its residents for publicity. Richard frowned, setting down his pen. Exploits them how? They're saying that we use their stories to garner donations but don't provide real, long-term support. It's gaining traction on social media. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the information. Is there any truth to the claim? Margaret shook her head. Not from what I can see. But you know how these things work. Once the narrative takes hold, it's hard to undo. Richard sighed, his mind racing. Schedule a meeting with the PR team. I want to address this head-on. That afternoon, Richard met with his public relations team to strategize. They decided on a three-pronged approach: transparency, testimonials, and action. Hope Harbor would release a detailed report outlining its programs, funding, and success stories, while also inviting journalists to visit the facilities and see the work firsthand. But Richard knew that wouldn't be enough. He needed to go deeper. "I want to talk to Henry," Richard said after the meeting. "If anyone can set the record straight, it's him." Henry was in the middle of a workshop with Hope Harbor residents when he received Richard's call. Taking a break, he stepped outside into the cool air and listened as Richard explained the situation. "People are saying we're exploiting the residents?" Henry repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Unfortunately, yes," Richard said. "I need your help to address it. No one knows the program better than you." Henry was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'll do whatever it takes. Hope Harbor changed my life, and I'll be damned if I let anyone tear it down." The following week, Henry and Richard sat down for an exclusive interview with a prominent news outlet. The journalist, a sharp and seasoned interviewer named Linda Carter, didn't hold back. "Critics say that Hope Harbor uses the stories of its residents for publicity," Linda began. "What's your response to that?" Henry leaned forward, his voice steady and clear. "I used to be one of those residents. 3 years ago, I was sitting on the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. Hope Harbor didn't just give me a place to sleep, it gave me a future. The people here don't want pity, they want opportunity. And that's what Hope Harbor provides." Linda turned to Richard. "Mr. Langston, as the founder of Hope Harbor, do you feel these criticisms are fair?" Richard took a deep breath before answering. "I understand why people might be skeptical. We live in a world where many initiatives fail to deliver on their promises. But Hope Harbor isn't about me, it's about the thousands of people who have rebuilt their lives through the program. If anyone doubts our intentions, I invite them to visit our facilities and see the impact for themselves." The interview aired nationwide, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Residents of Hope Harbor centers came forward to share their stories, flooding social media with testimonials about how the program had changed their lives. The narrative shifted, and the criticism faded into the background. With the crisis averted, Richard and Henry turned their attention back to their work. But the experience had left them both shaken. It was a stark reminder of how fragile even the best intentions could be in the face of public scrutiny. One evening, as they sat in the original Hope Harbor facility, Richard turned to Henry. "Do you ever think we're in over our heads?" Henry smiled wryly. "Every day. But then I look at Sophie or Marcus or any of the people we've helped, and I know it's worth it." Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough. If we're really making a difference." Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't fix everything, Richard. But we've already changed so many lives. That has to count for something." Meanwhile, Sophie had blossomed into a confident and compassionate young woman. She had taken on a leadership role at the original Hope Harbor facility, organizing events and mentoring younger residents. Her dream of running her own center one day was becoming more and more tangible. One day, as she and Henry were sorting through donated supplies, she turned to him with a determined expression. "Dad, I think it's time I take the next step." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Next step? I want to start my own Hope Harbor Center," Sophie said. "A place specifically for kids and teens. They face challenges that are different from adults, and I think we could do more to support them." Henry felt a swell of pride. "That's an incredible idea, Sophie. But it's a big responsibility." "I know," Sophie said. "But I'm ready. And I want to do this with you and Uncle Rich Guy." Henry chuckled. "We'll talk to him. Something tells me he'll be on board." When Sophie presented her idea to Richard, he was immediately supportive. "A Hope Harbor Center for kids and teens," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I love it. Let's make it happen." Over the next year, Sophie's vision became a reality. With the support of her father and Richard, she opened the first youth-focused Hope Harbor Center, complete with counseling services, educational programs, and recreational activities. The center quickly became a safe haven for young people in the community, offering them a chance to heal, grow, and dream. At the grand opening of Sophie's Center, Richard stood beside Henry, watching as Sophie delivered a heartfelt speech to the crowd. "Hope Harbor gave my dad and me a second chance," Sophie said, her voice steady and strong. "It showed us that no matter how hard life gets, there's always hope. This center is for every kid out there who feels like they don't have a future. You do. And we're here to help you find it." The crowd erupted into applause, and Henry wiped away a tear. "She's amazing, isn't she?" Richard nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "She's going to change the world." As the sun set that evening, Richard, Henry, and Sophie stood outside the new center, reflecting on how far they had come. "Do you think this is just the beginning?" Sophie asked, looking up at her father and Richard. Henry smiled. "It feels like it." Richard placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "The beginning of something incredible." And as they stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, they knew that their journey was far from over, but that the best was yet to come.